Why is everything new so ugly? From architecture to cars, fashion and beauty, interior design, replacing what used to be colorful and detailed, expressive with this gray, beige, black and white, simple designs that have zero life to them, which is crazy to think about when you compare that to civilizations of hundreds of years ago where they had less manpower, less technology, less resources, and were creating entire coliseums and these massive, beautiful structures, even more beautiful than the world that we live in today. It's almost as if the word modern and new has become synonymous with anything that looks monochromatic, simple, and utterly lifeless. This blows my mind. When I think of media like Back to the Future or The Jetsons, a cartoon made in 1964 that was set 100 years in the future, how their interpretation of this future was colorful and expressive, interesting and technologically driven, yet the more into the future that we get, the less colorful and lively and interesting that future actually looks. So how the hell did this happen? Why is everything new so ugly? And when did we decide to just remove all color from our society at all? Well, that is exactly the question we set out to solve here today, because I have a theory that this is the result of a frankly late stage capitalism and deceptive marketing practices that have tricked people into thinking that what they're seeing is new and modern, when in actuality, it's just cheap. Is that an open concept house, or is that just a cheaply designed room where they didn't want to pay for extra walls and cabinets? Is it clean beauty, or is it just selling you beauty products with less pigment and less colors that are significantly cheaper to make? Is it modern to use concrete and aluminum, or are those just two of the most cheaply mass-produced materials? Is it a sleek looking exterior, or did they just not want to spend money to add any detail to the product at all? All of this is true. This glamour of modernism is built off a lie used by massive corporations to make money and frankly rip you off, kinda. And I have multiple pieces of evidence that support this theory. In this week's episode of Nicky at Night, we will analyze why everything new is so ugly, the art history that got us to this point, and the marketing tactic used to manipulate millions of people across the world into actually believing that these things are new and modern when frankly, they're just cheap, awful knockoffs. Welcome back to Nicky at Night. I'm your host, Nicky Reardon, and I'm so excited to be back with y'all this week. I apologize for a slight delay. I was with my mom. She was here visiting, but this video was actually inspired by a Mina Lay video, which if you don't know Mina Lay, I think she's my favorite YouTuber now. At least my favorite YouTuber actively making YouTube videos in this moment. Like her analysis, she did this video on the curse of modernism, really talking about this topic. And a lot of the research and points we're going to make are super similar. But I think a lot of like my thought process or the reasoning to how I arrived at these conclusions is a lot differently than hers. But she is my dream creator. Like I just want to be her, honestly. And she's my dream guest on this show, truly. Like I just think if you locked me and her in a room, we would talk for hours. With that, I'm super excited to dive into this week's topic. Also, did you know that 94% of the people who watch this show are not subscribed? What are you doing, girls? Let's hit the imagine if you could hit a red button, literally 2 clicks below where you are right now, and have more of this content that you already enjoy and watch every single week, guaranteed to be seen by your eyeballs every single week. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? And we are at 800 5-star reviews on Spotify. We're setting a goal to get it to 1,000 by the end of the year. Listen to this show at the gym. Listen to it on your car ride at work. If you love the show on YouTube, you'll love it on Spotify too. Go give us a follow over there. And yeah, I think that we can absolutely do it. Also, we are almost at 50K subscribers on YouTube, ? That is our goal for the end of the year. We can fucking do that. In 2 months, we can do that. So again, hit subscribe. Don't forget. With that, let's dive into this week's topic. And frankly, this death of everything beautiful and artistic in our world, it seems like. And I think there are 3 sort of categories I have thought about this in. Number one, in terms of like architecture and interior design, you know, these like modern houses, modern interiors. Think of the Kim Kardashian house. Number 2, in technology and cars specifically. I don't know why I was thinking so much about that god awful Tesla truck. Everybody hates it. Everyone. It is like the worst design product ever. It's hideous. But I really think that that is a design, like a symptom of a larger problem that we've seen with this advancement of technology and product design around technology. And then last is just some notes on fashion and beauty, specifically also in terms of how recessions or like pieces of economic uncertainty actually lead to a lot of increase in different trends. There's a really interesting study that supports some of these that I'll bring up later on. And I think just like looking at this concept as a whole, it's so easy to think that everything's just, oh my God, it's just all ugly now. What happened? But this is a result of like centuries of history. So why is everything so ugly? And where did this obsession with monochromatic, beige, lifeless colors come from? Well, many people trace this back to ancient Greece and the Roman architecture or statues, but this is actually false. Did you know that all of these statues and all of these buildings used to be painted? The Greek and Roman buildings we know today were lavish with color. The only reason we perceive them as these white marble statues today is because over centuries that color deteriorated and eroded. So all that was left was the marble. But actuality, our perception of what ancient Greece and ancient Rome looks like is built off of a complete and utter lie. The New Yorker actually published a piece on this exact phenomenon called The Myth of Whiteness in Classical Sculpture. This entire romanticization of this white marble aesthetic is built entirely off of this misunderstanding, but it was far too late. By the time that the technology had come around to be able to like scrape pieces of this fragment and test it for pigments, or by the time they had finally started to dig up some archaeological excavations of ancient Greece and Rome where there was some color still intact, we had dealt with centuries of the Renaissance, the artistic Renaissance that really romanticized this civilization of ancient Greece and Rome. So at that point, it was really embedded into our culture. So like by the 14th century, we saw the start of the Renaissance and an increase of this idealization of Greco-Roman culture. So any sort of art or paintings or architecture were frequently done to be recreations of this time, to pay homage to this time, without realizing that entire style that they loved and adopted was not actually real or based in any sense of fact. But that continued for 300 years. So over time, this idealization of marble and these like almost completely opaque structures and objects was so deeply embedded into society, it just became synonymous with being regal and this symbol of status. Because Rome was very often perceived as the greatest civilization or the most manly civilization for centuries. In fact, it even became very common for politicians of other countries in centuries later on to depict themselves in these all-white statues. Or, I mean, even think of the way Washington, D.C. looks in America, right? It is entirely white marble built off of this idea of the great republic of ancient Rome, and that if we are going to build a great republic, we should mimic the image of the great republic. But the Great Republic did not even look like that, which is so interesting to think about. I don't know why. I think that's such an interesting thing, how much of our society, even today, in this I mean, look behind me, white walls, right? That came from people not understanding like architecture and like this digging up old buildings that they just thought all looked like this, but they don't actually look like that. Like that to me is so interesting. I would also like to note that this has historically led to the whitewashing of historical figures. They talk about this a lot in this article as well, of how a lot of the reason people think certain people in history were white is because the only things we really had of them were these statues. And over time, any sort of pigment that was used to differentiate what culture or skin tone they were eroded over time. All that was left beneath it was this like stone or marble. So people were just like, oh, they must have been white, which is just ridiculous and so not true at all. And it's really interesting. Again, like even if I encourage you to like do some research about like this ancient Greco-Roman like gods and goddesses, like they weren't all these perfectly white people. Like they were a mix of cultures and ethnicities. And it is really sad that so much of that is lost from our history. But it is also fascinating how it created this domino effect. It created this, again, like this romanticization of this specific style, this specific art form. Because of that, those materials became super valuable. Because those materials were valuable, people wanted to build with them. They wanted houses made out of them. And that just perpetuated for forever. And then going into like this architecture phenomena specifically, we really see the rise of modernism happen in the early 1900s, specifically after World War I. After World War I, there was all of these like young men and a lot of young women that had stayed home that had just come back from war or were people at home, contributing to the war. They were rationing, doing all of these things, and they didn't have a lot of money. And all of these people really wanted houses. They wanted to live. They wanted to build a life in America now. So there was a lot of government assistance and stimulus to develop the suburbs. We also have this rise in industrialization during that time, right? Like the invention of the assembly line and factories made it so the things were now starting to be mass produced as opposed to being individually produced for the first time ever. And prior to this, most homes were designed by the homeowner or like commissioned by the homeowner in some way. You got ready to buy a home, you would go to a builder, you would say, this is what I want, and people built it that way. But as this industrialization starts to pick up, they realize that, oh, well, if all of these homes look the same or use the same materials, then ahead of time, we can just mass produce these materials. It'll be way faster, way cheaper, and way easier to build. Especially, we see this deterioration of hardwood and brick, and an increase of like concrete and glass and steel or aluminum. A lot of these materials, again, that were hard to manage now are able to be, managed in this assembly line industrialization structure, but also like bricks and wood are hard to use and they're expensive. So once people realized that they could start building things with cheaper stuff, they just did. And at the time, the consumer base had no problem with that at all because they were people who had just come home from a war and were very eager to like start a life and own a home and all of these things that had felt impossible to them before. But because there was this massive, rise of the suburbs and rise of modernism, they start producing houses this way, which brings us to the great rise of suburbia, which really, again, gets perpetuated in the 50s and 60s. So after World War II, we have this mass migration of people coming home, people wanting to build a life, especially after World War II. This was really what people had it was the big one, the biggest war in history. And people were so excited to just build. There was this, rising sentiment of Americanism, and this concept of the nuclear family was really born. So again, there is tons of government stimulus to allow better zoning laws, giving tax deductions, good interest rates. And this is why areas like Los Angeles, for example, that were primarily developed during the 50s and 60s are so rich with beautiful architecture of varying styles, right? You can see Spanish style architecture next to something more colonial, next to something more traditional. Like Los Angeles neighborhoods are stunning and so unlike the East Coast where I'm from, where a lot of the things on the East Coast were built out of this, like what I like to call cardboard box suburbia, which we'll talk about later on. But because so much of Los Angeles really boomed during the 50s and 60s, this was still when there was a lot more personalization in home building, or a lot of the things that were being built to be lived in. This is another shift that happens later on, where now most of the things that are built to sell. They are built by these massive conglomerates that develop and build real estate to then try and rent out to the highest bidder or rent out to as many people as possible. Whereas when there's these emerging cities during the 20th century, people were moving there and wanting a home there. So they were building them and new areas would pop up. Again, like even if you look at an area like Pasadena in Los Angeles, it's such a beautiful time capsule. Like you can tell when the area was developed because of the architecture in that area. And honestly, from the 50s to 70s, I think is when we really hit this peak and sweet spot of like creativity in America, because it was right when like technology was starting to get good. Like we had electricity and we had electrical appliances and like machines that could build things, but it also wasn't into this late stage capitalism that I'll talk about later on, where everything is mass produced and they won't make anything unless it is mass produced. Like something about the 50s to 70s is when I think we were just still on an uptick of like America and building things, but also there was this renaissance of art really happened a lot in the 70s. You know, you think of things like Woodstock happening and all of that. It became a peace-loving civilization. And specifically the rise of interior design and a lot more effort placed towards what the home looks like comes from the 1960s, actually, when Jackie Kennedy did the first ever tour of the White House, this on national television, which, keep in mind, events on national television were still like not that common then. And for the first lady to be showing people the inside of the White House, which at the time, I believe you couldn't see at all. Like nobody really knew what the inside of the White House looks like. So she did a tour, a very like what we think of kind of like architectural digest tours now, honestly, is what Jackie Kennedy did in the 60s. And this was such a massively popular event that it created this wave of suburban women wanting to make their home look like Jackie Kennedy or wanting to make their home look like the White House. And I think this is where the first level of like influence in terms of like mainstream media and interior design really starts to take place. So because of that, in the 60s and 70s, we see this huge rise of interior design. Also, the creation essentially of postmodernism, which is this trend in the 70s that is like insane maximalist, like almost to the point where it's like kind of trippy and it looks like you're like on an LSD trip, like things with unconventional shapes and like they aren't the way that they should be, essentially. And I think this is the first example of the pendulum really like swinging back. And I think in all forms of art or media or culture, like the pendulum is always swinging between what people like and then what is new and cutting edge, right? Because the second something stops being popular, it becomes the norm. And then once it's the norm, nobody wants it anymore. So then they want to move back. So I think because this, again, very Jackie Kennedy, very luxury, elegant, put together style was so popular in the 60s, in the 70s, when things like Woodstock start happening, we become the rise of hippies, you know, happens that there is this boom on renaissance of like really interesting creative design. And I also think if you just look at like the color palettes of like any TV show or anything set in the 70s, and the 80s, or just fashion of those decades, like they are so colorful and expressive. And that is really why I think it was the pendulum swinging away from what we had come from in the 50s and 60s. And then as we move into the 90s, there is another boom of homeowners. This is really like the first time in the 20th century that there had been like prolonged decades without war. Like just people were born into peace and became adults in peace, like for the first time ever. So more 18-year-olds were going to college or going to work, whereas previously they would turn 18 and go to war. So there is a big boom of the suburbs once again. Real estate was also widely seen as one of the best investments at the time. It was actually viewed as a foolproof investment, which is later what goes on to contribute to the 2008 financial crisis, which would be a different podcast episode for a different day. But at the time, like because there had been such long decades of prosperity and growth in America, all these homes just were always appreciating in value. So all these people with money or developers or investors were like, well, let's just keep building stuff. So they did. But because of that too, again, this is when this mass production and industrialization really comes in, because by now a lot of these neighborhoods and communities exist, right? There had already been this development in the 50s and 60s. So now there is things like homeowners associations and smaller city governments. So in order to build something, a developer or real estate agent has to submit a proposal. They have to come up with the design. They have to say what it's going to look like, blah, blah, blah. They go through these submission processes to get these things approved. Once they are approved by the HOA or by the city government, whatever, then they can start building. So because of this, developers didn't want to spend a lot of time drawing 30 different designs if 26 of them were going to get shot down. So as soon as like 3 or 4 designs got approved, they just stopped. They're just like, okay, great. We're going to have 3 or 4 designs and we're going to build an entire neighborhood and all of the houses are going to be in like these 3 or 4 designs. And this is what N+1 magazine called this cardboard modernism. And this is literally what the suburbs I grew up look like. I grew up in the suburbs of Virginia. And from the outside, it looks like that they are different houses. Some of them are wood paneling. Some of them have a little bit of brick. Some of them have the garage on the left side, the garage on the right side. Some might have a porch, where some might have a back porch. They are the same house. There is literally like 3 interior designs of my neighborhood. Like my best friend who grew up like walking distance from my house, 7 houses over, and another friend I had who grew up like 4 or 5 blocks in a different direction. We have the exact same house. The interior of our houses are identical. They developed these neighborhoods to look different, but on the inside, they are all the same. And that is where I think this really interesting thing with modernism and governments and like technicality comes in. So homes stopped being personal and started becoming commodified. And once they stopped being personal, they lost all aspect of personality. It was no longer about designing the best thing that met the needs of that family, but designing the least controversial thing possible, right? They didn't need you to love it anymore. They just needed you not to hate it. That is why white walls exist more than colored walls pretty much everywhere. It is so much easier to imagine how you would live on a blank canvas than it is to look at a fully painted canvas and try and paint over it, right? Like something about white is just, you can always imagine something there. But a yellow room, you might be like, oh, well, my carpet doesn't go with yellow, so I don't want to live in this room. So because of that, they just started painting everything white, right? Or you see that with the rise of Zillow. Now that we have apps, they're not in the home when they make a judgment on whether they want to see it or not. Like before, you had to just show up to a random house and decide if you liked it. But now people look at pictures on the internet. So they design the house to be as perfectly photographed, right? That's also why you see the rise of like dark flooring, this like gray paneled flooring, which I hate. It is my least favorite. Why are we using gray? Why? Who likes gray? Name 3 people in your life who has said my favorite color is gray. Name 3 people who have said like, I don't know how I could go with a week without staring at a gray floor. It is so lifeless. It is soulless. But the reason they do it is the best material at hiding dirt. That's it. Like literally, it's cheap to make. It hides dirt really well. So if you look at a picture with white walls and a dark floor, you're like, wow, this is so new. With that, people perceive something looking clean as being new. And if you have lived in any city, you know how not true this is, where they love to slather some white paint on the wall, repaint the floor, send people on the apartment tour and say like, oh yeah, it's amazing, blah, blah, blah. And then 2 weeks in, your pipes break down. 2 weeks in, your AC's on the fritz. Like just because it has a fresh coat of paint doesn't mean it's new, but something about it just mentally, like we perceive these things as being new or feeling cleaner because it has a fresh coat of white paint, even though under it is what has always been there, and like that is true of everything. So again, it's interesting how like once these things became inventory, they weren't built for a specific person or a specific family anymore. They were built to be not controversial, make something as cheap as possible. How can we get past all these zoning laws? And then how can we list it on Zillow or apartments.com? How can people look at it, not hate it enough so that they want to come and tour it and we can rent it? Like there was no personality anymore. And this is also really when we see the death of things like built-in furniture, which is so sad to me as somebody who loves Los Angeles architecture. I love built-in furniture. It's also just like objectively more practical for the space in every single way. Like why would you have a wardrobe sticking out of the wall when it could just be built into the wall and then you have more space in the room? But the reason they stopped doing that is, 1, now they would have to pay for the wardrobe or they would have to pay for whatever built-in furniture is there. And 2, if somebody's like, well, I would want to put my bed on that wall, then they're like, oh, well, that person might not rent it. So instead, again, it's the least controversial thing. Nobody will have a problem with 4 walls. They can't have a problem with 4 walls. It's a house. And like, so 4 walls is all we have now. You know what I mean? And like over time, these things just kept happening. And it led to this erasure of what was interesting or unique about a home. And I think you can even see how this impact affected commercial real estate. Like the old Taco Bell versus new Taco Bell lives in my mind rent free. And it goes to show how much like modernism just destroyed all creativity in our society, because the old Taco Bell was so fucking cool. It was so cool. It was like so 90s, like the color palette was so interesting and captivating. Also, like as a kid, like imagine you're a 6-year-old kid. Which of those two spaces would you want to be in? Obviously, like the cool, colorful one, right? But because there was this rise of modernism and we have to make everything look sleek and interesting, all of these fast food places completely decided to kill off their old designs, completely kill off anything with character to make something very just like not controversial. Again, what was their goal with a lot of these spaces? To make it look cleaner. But in doing that, they killed off any sense of brand identity. They killed off any sense of artistry or creativity. It just made it so the inside of a McDonald's now looks like the inside of a Taco Bell, which looks like the inside of a Chick-fil-A, which looks like blah, blah, blah. And when you compare that to a restaurant like In-N-Out specifically, which is a burger place that never rebranded, never changed its inside, In-N-Out's everything. I love eating inside the In-N-Out. Like it's so cool. It has its own custom wallpaper. It's still that like white and red Americana diner like color palette that we all like loved and like saw growing up. Like it has its own unique POV. And what's really sad is in this, again, it's like what I always say, when you try to appeal to everyone, you end up appealing to no one. Like the rebrand of Taco Bell is the perfect example of that. Like it used to be so cool and interesting and such a like unique color palette, but then they rebranded to just being fine. Everything about it is just fine. And with that, it lost all sense of like artistry or creativity. But I would like to say, I do think the pendulum always swings back and forth. And this is really why I want to talk about specifically interior design, technology, and fashion. So like the second one thing becomes popular, 10 years later, the next thing's going to be popular. And we see this happen all the time, right? So like something I really think about too is like, let's view like Y2K, right? Very colorful. It was like the pink phones and the low-cut jeans. It was a very maximalist era. Then into the 2010s, it becomes very minimalist, right? Think of this like Kim Kardashian house where it's like all white. Also, why? 2008 recession, right? It's not fun to be maximalist in a recession. Like it's really fucking expensive. It's a lot more fun to be minimalist in a recession. I also think there just became this notion of once work became so common and such an integrated part of people's lives that people wanted their house to feel calm. But now, like, and this is something even I think Kim like mentions in this weird interview of her house where she talked about, oh, like I'm so busy all the time, blah, blah, blah. Like I like that when I come home, it's just like, it's stillness. It's nothing.
And I want everything to feel calming.
And I do get that for people. I mean, especially for people with like really, really busy jobs. Like you don't want to come home to 87 things on the wall if you're stressed and overwhelmed in your mind, because an overwhelming physical space will lead to an overwhelming mental space. But now that we live in a post-pandemic world, I do think that we are going to see this pendulum swing back, because Google searches and Google trends for things like DIY paint, peel and stick wallpaper are at an all-time high. Like these things are being searched more often than ever. And I think it's really interesting because the pandemic changed the way we view the home, right? We used to have a workspace, a living space, and a third space, right? So like a third space where we hung out with our friends, a place where we work, and a place where we rest and relax. Post-pandemic, all those things merged into one, right? We had to start living at home. We had to start working from home. And if we wanted to interact with people or hang out, whatever, we could only do it at home. So once all three of these things, these three spaces became one space, I do think it's interesting to think about how the design of that space will change in response. Like it's not a coincidence that in a post-pandemic world, you know, everybody wants to decorate their apartment. And if you're working from home all the time, like you better fucking like it, you know? So going back to architecture, I think that that's also probably why there has been a large pull towards these like big industrial apartment complexes, you know, because those are the only spaces where they come with a gym. They might come with a pool. They might come with a little workspace. So you feel like you're lessening this burden of making your apartment a smaller space into all three of those things. And the reason people go to these apartment complexes now is because they're like, okay, well, my apartment can be the living space. And then the gym down there can be like a third space, or this workspace. Like, you're getting more options for your living situation. And then also just renovations in general. Again, like if you think about the 90s and like the styles of the 90s, like these awful wooden cabinets, like so like terribly colored, there's like weird tile colors. So they're very maximalist, they're very warm. So in the 2000s, anybody who did a renovation in like the 2000s, 2010s wanted the opposite of that. So they had these very sleek styles. It was getting rid of the wood cabinet for a monochromatic cabinet, you know? Over time, now that that's the norm, now that's what we live in, if people renovate or want to change things again, the pendulum has to swing back. This is also, I think, where it gets really fascinating with technology. Technology has been such an interesting perpetuation of modernism, and how this concept of something being like futuristic or high tech has become synonymous with boring design. And it is so weird to me. It is so weird to me that we are like, the iPhone, that's supposed to be like the most high-tech phone, or at least they brand themselves that way, is so fucking simple. It is like a black screen. There's no color on the back. Or like again, going back to this Tesla truck, like it is hideous. And it's interesting that this idea of futurism is now very boring, when in the past, again, talking about things like the Jetsons, this idea of futurism was like so expressive and colorful. Or Back to the Future, like their future was always this grandiose. It was maximalist. But the closer we get to that future, the uglier our society is. And that is so bizarre to me. And I think a really big reason of that is the iPhone. This is part of where I get a little like weirdly conspiracy, but trust me, there is like reasons to support this. Okay. Number one, just so you understand, the iPhone is the most profitable product ever made. I'm pretty sure there's nothing more profitable than the iPhone. One, it like the only product that has like the amount of sales in a year as like a pair of sneakers. Like as many people are buying iPhones as they are buying like Air Force Ones. And two, it is the only product that has the same amount of markup as a luxury product. Like it costs them like a few $100 to make, and they sell it for like $1,500, but then sell them as much as they sell like another brand would be selling pairs of shoes for $50. So because of that, the iPhone becomes this beacon of the technological era. Either Apple is viewing it as their holy grail product, or every other tech company is, how do we make our iPhone? How do we get our version of the iPhone? And at the time, what was really interesting is the iPhone was innovative. It's not really that innovative anymore, but when like the first like few, I'd say like 10 generations of the iPhone, it was objectively like the most high tech and interesting phone on the market. You know, like I remember when we went from having like BlackBerry keyboards to like touch screens, and how crazy that was, right? Crazy. It was the first time that like a reduction of features was also synonymous with the progression of technology, right? Like you don't need a keyboard anymore because you can just do it on your phone now. Like you can just type it. Or you don't need a separate camera because there's just a camera in the phone now, right? Like there was innovation and minimalism for the first time ever were like really coinciding with one another, which is very interesting. Like it's fascinating that the more high tech something was, like the less actually like accessories and things or features you had to have around it. So because of that, the iPhone really brands itself around being like very minimalist, I mean, even look at the Apple stores, right? Like they're very one tone, they're all white, it's super minimalist, there's nothing on the wall, and that is perceived as like futuristic or high tech. So every other brand copies it. They just copy it, right? Like they're all like, okay, like this is how we have to make it. If this is what the best-selling phone in the world looks like, this is the design of the best-selling phone in the world, then our design better be something not completely far off, or why would people buy it? This just keeps rinse repeating over time. But now the iPhone is really not that innovative. Like there's really nothing that special about the iPhone. In fact, there's like objectively many other better phones out there on the market. We just love Apple, the brand now. And also I'm saying this like as a literally telling you this on a Mac. I own an iPhone. Like I know that the iPhone is not the most like cutting edge piece of technology. However, this sentiment of what modernism, what high tech, what future looks like has become embedded into our brains as a society. So anytime something is designed, it's silver, it's white, it's black. That is why you see these like, again, these like Tesla trucks, for examples. And what's so fascinating to me about like cars specifically is cars used to be stunning. stunning. Oh my God, like a 1950s to 70s Mercedes, like any car built by that company in those decades. Are you kidding me? They're beautiful. They are beautiful. Vintage cars are incredible. They had color, they had design details, they had all of these interesting things about them. And cars of today are so ugly. They are so ugly because it's all about being high tech, and being high tech has become synonymous with essentially being boring. And that is like so freaking interesting for me to think about because it's just objectively not true. And also, like, I don't understand why these brands are so dumb. They're so dumb. If somebody made a car that looked like this and just like I could fucking use Apple AirPlay on it, like, take my money, please. Take my money. The only reason we all don't have vintage cars is because they're like hard to find, hard to repair, and they don't have like features we need, like air conditioning and shit like that. But if somebody just made like an interesting car design with like a few, like, let me use Bluetooth and have some AC and like, take my money, please. Truly, truly, you can have it. This goes into fashion and beauty. Fashion and beauty is really another interesting one to talk about with like this progression of civilization and how back in the day, wearing beige clothing meant it was like a symbol of being poor, honestly. Like it meant that you couldn't afford nice dyes and nice fabrics. So the noble class would dress as colorful, as extravagant as possible to display their wealth. And if you look at old pictures or paintings of like kings or nobility, that is why they're often depicted in like red or purple or fabrics with multiple colors or fabrics with multiple patterns, because those were hard materials to get back then. They were hard to acquire and maintain. So having them meant some symbol of status. However, nowadays, it almost feels like not drawing attention to yourself has become more of a symbol of elegance and class, right? Think of like the quiet luxury aesthetic, or clean beauty was like a big trend of the past year. And it is so interesting to me that in a world where we are surrounded by social media, we have infinite access to information on our fingertips at all times. We have shrinking attention spans. Attention has become a form of currency. Like to have people paying attention to you at anything in any way is now monetizable. That didn't exist, right? Even me talking to you right now. Like I will make not a lot of money, but some semblance of money from like advertisements on the video, right? Like that, everything about attention, talking about a topic, me literally talking about how I hate gray floors is monetizable, which is very interesting. So because that attention became monetizable, I think now this idea of not needing attention, not wanting attention is a sign of class and wealth. Does that make sense? Like, because like if somebody is fine with not being perceived or fine with not looking or dressing interesting or whatever, it's because they have some semblance of comfort already. Like they don't need that attention. You know what I mean? And also what I think is really interesting too with fashion is how recessions and the economy impacts trends. There's another fascinating article called How Recessions Drive Innovation in Fashion by GQ. This talks about how the economy and fashion, they have like this like symbiotic relationship with one another. And it's really funny how you can actually look at fashion trends to predict the economy. One of my favorite ones is how trends with purses are like have a direct correlation with the economy. So like during times of economic boom, the most bought purse, the most trendy, the most searched purse will be a really big bag. It will have tons of things on it. Whereas when we're in a recession, it is always a micro purse or a tiny little bag. And it's because the things that are being bought or sought after the most are the cheapest in a recession, or when people have disposable income, they want to buy a nice bag. Also, you see things like just, again, minimalism on the rise, right? Like it's really hard to be wearing 10 layers, to have really cool jewelry, to have really cool makeup, all these maximalist things when you don't have money in the bank. Like you can't afford it all. It's a lot easier to just dress like Finn from Adventure Time, very sleek and trendy and chic, you know? And because of that, you'll see a lot of these minimalist products rise. Again, also just talking about this industrialization, brands really, really love it when their number one product is very cheap to make and easy to produce, right? Like they would much, much rather have their number one selling product be a black pair of leggings than like this blue jersey fabric pair of shorts that I'm wearing. Why? Leggings don't have any dye. You can mass produce them. They're a very simple product. These pair of shorts has multiple materials. It has some dye in it. Because there's multiple materials, people might have to hand sew it. So then there's the labor cost for the people who are hand sewing it, blah, blah, blah. These brands are pushing their simple products to be their biggest products. And again, like think of like this athleisure, such a perfect example of that, of how it is really just minimalist designs passed off as like, oh, it's cool because you can wear it and you can also wear it to the gym. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to sell you is like, okay, like we make our most money and it's easiest to produce these leggings or like these sweats or just like a one color sports coat. How do we market it? How do we come up with a name for it? How do we make it a trend or a movement in culture so that people think they're buying something new and cutting edge, but actually what we're selling you is what is easiest for us to make and cheapest for us to make. And you also see this with just the rise of various aesthetics. It could be minimalism during a recession. It's also sometimes, a lot of times, grunge aesthetics are known to rise during areas of economic instability. So like, instead of buying a new pair of jeans, it's more cool to wear these like trendy, beat up pair of jeans. And that's because people don't actually it's really just because people don't want to buy new jeans, But these aesthetics always move in response like to the economy and the things around us. So anytime there is this piece of instability, like kind of what we've been going through for the past 4 years in America, modernist trends come on the rise. These minimalist things come on the rise. And I think, again, like clean beauty is another probably great example of this one, where people can say it's like, oh, I just like a simple look and it feels good and clean. But like at the end of the day, it's because a color palette, a makeup palette is fucking expensive. There's so much pigment and shadow. And if you do that every single day, it's expensive to maintain. It's time consuming to maintain. And people don't want to do that during areas of political instability. But if you look back during like, I don't know, the 2012 to like 2017 era of YouTube, these big makeup looks were popping off all the time, right? And it's because that was a much better economy. We had just come out of the Obama administration and we were seeing this economic growth in America. Honestly, I could talk about recession trends for forever. Let me know if I should do a video about that at some point. I am so fascinated with things like this, like how media and culture are always like this symbiotic relationship, and people think things just happen, but it's like always a symptom of something else. So with that, what is happening with modernism and why is everything so ugly? At the end of the day, industrialization, capitalism, cheap people, doing things that are easy, and boredom. And TLDR, like that's really what it is. But it's fascinating to me that, again, over like hundreds of years, centuries of art history is really how these things happened, whether it's that romanticization of marble to creating these white wall structures to, how we behaved in post-war civilizations to civilizations that have never experienced a war. Like all of this led up to this rise of modernism. But I do think the pendulum is switching back. I also think, again, too, it's interesting that as we are seeing time and time again, these beautiful, like rustic, like structures with history and personality to them are getting torn down to build these like very common looking apartment complexes or modern buildings, that there is now less supply of buildings with history that are interesting and have a personality to it. And when there's less supply, demand goes up and prices go up with them too, especially in Los Angeles, which is another video for a different day. But like, because of that, I do think that these things are coming back, or we're seeing how much this like customization of the rental property is becoming so common, It will also be interesting to see how this era of, modernism and modern houses goes with our generation, Gen Z, probably not being fucking homeowners because we can't afford it. So it's interesting to me that we're going to have all of this boom of suburbia. I think I saw a statistic recently that said over 60% of the people that live in the suburbs right now are empty nesters. So parents who already had kids and their kids are gone. 60% of people living in the suburbs are now people living in houses without actually families in them. And as more people of our generation don't want to buy these houses because we can't, we also don't want to have kids as often. It'll be very interesting to see how, again, this like concept of modernism, like what's going to happen to all these modern properties. I think nobody's going to fucking want them. That is my prediction, locking it in. Okay. But I don't know. Let me know if you guys thought. I know this was like a kind of different topic for this week. I hope it was interesting. Shout outs to Mina Lay for inspiring this entire video. Please go and watch her video. Her video is so amazing. I'm fucking obsessed with that girl. I think she's a genius. Give the podcast 5-star rating. Do it now. Follow us on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and I'll see y'all next week. Bye.